account just so that you know, since we've all probably received the notice simultaneously, the meeting is being recorded. And this is a presentation on accountable to whom and for what, a historical view of the Milwaukee Fire and Police Commission, which will be presented by Will Tchakirides, who will introduce himself shortly. My name is Emilio Dottore. I'm the Executive Director of the Milwaukee Turners and also a proud member of the National Lawyers Guild. And co-presenting with me today or answering questions at the end is...
Hi, I'm Molly Collins. I'm the Advocacy Director at the ACLU of Wisconsin.
And we are really fortunate to have Will, who's going to take it from here.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Thanks everyone for joining me. I want to thank the National Lawyers Guild and the Wisconsin ACLU for inviting me to speak with you all today. While my work doesn't focus expressly on the Milwaukee Fire and Police Commission, and by no means do I consider myself an expert on the agency, it does take up Milwaukee's long struggle for police accountability, really ever since the FPC, which I'll refer to it as, came into being in 1885. Now, the commission has played a critical role in framing our understanding of police accountability in Milwaukee, and reforming the FPC's function has long served as a point of emphasis for police accountability advocates in the city. But it's not the full story I try to tell in my writing, and I'm broadly interested in sort of the politics of police accountability as it relates to everyday citizens, organizations, movements, politicians, but also institutions like the FPC. So let me tell you a little bit about who I am. I'm a PhD candidate at UW-Milwaukee, longtime student over there, who's interested in issues of police power and grassroots struggles to unmake police power. My research specifically traces Milwaukee's unheralded history of professionalization, police reform, and repression, as well as Black-led efforts to sort of reimagine public safety on more democratic and humane terms. So the story I try to tell really spans a long period. It extends over 130 years, which I think a lot of folks know here in this chat. It remains ongoing today. It's an unsettling history. It's a frustrating history, but it's also one that inspires a lot of hope. I'm particularly uplifted by the organizations that are active in this arena today, such as the African American Roundtable, Leaders Igniting Transformation, Milwaukee Alliance Against Racist and Political Repression. It's these groups who are on the vanguard, many of them led by Black women, who are advocating for divestment of our tax dollars from policing, who are trying to rid our public schools of armed police officers, and who are working to establish community control over public safety and their policing structures. Community control has a long history in the city, the fight for community control. I also just want to lift up quickly Voces de la Frontera and Youth Engaged in the Struggle for the work they've done around ending crimigation and challenging sort of the cozy relationships between federal and local police authorities. My work doesn't focus explicitly on Latinx experiences or immigrant experiences with the police, but that is a crucial part of the story of police violence in Milwaukee, and that goes back decades as well. Borders, quote unquote, borders are enforced by police agencies and these borders are all around us. So, whether I'm in my current home state of Texas, I live in Texas now, or in, Milwaukee's hyper-segregated environment, I think it's important to recognize that we need to think expansively around the idea of borders and the boundary work that police do. So I can speak from, about a decade of experience researching the history of police accountability activism in Milwaukee. And I'll let you know firsthand just from reading the sources that it requires unrelenting commitment, which I think a lot of the organizations listening in here know very well. At almost every turn, local power structures in the city have adapted and sort of recalibrated in ways that have affirmed the legitimacy of the police to solve urban problems. And they've also sort of worked to adapt and uphold the capitalist system that has relied on the police to exploit and extract wealth, often wealth from communities of color and the poor. Right, so I think few organizations really know this as well as the ACLU of Wisconsin and its Milwaukee chapter, which filed, a class action lawsuit in 2017 or so against Milwaukee's police bureaucracy and its, invasive racist stop and frisk practices. They've also historically challenged, civil asset forfeiture, and other extractive policing method. So this is accountability just as much as sort of the lethal use of force and, police brutality, physical brutality. We should kind of pause here and just think about what we mean by police accountability. Our criminal justice system is designed to sort of undermine accountability, which means the act of holding police officers and agencies responsible for their actions. This is despite a range of options that, should allow for accountability. In theory, police supervisors, they should respond with discipline when patrolmen under their command abuse their authority. Too often, they protect negligent employees, reinforcing, an insular police work culture that condones misbehavior and violence, and it promotes an us versus them mentality. In theory, also, state prosecutors should hold police accountable when they find probable cause that officers have violated the law. They should also file criminal charges against these officers. However, district attorneys are often unwilling to bring charges, knowing that they might sabotage other cases or undermine the relationships with police who support criminal investigations. And police also serve as expert witnesses in court. So many DAs, I should also say, also sort of accept campaign donations and endorsements from police unions, which is really problematic. In theory, state legislatures, they can enact laws that raise standards of police conduct. They can shape regulations that enhance accountability. And this kind of relates to the Fire and Police Commission, which we'll get to. But they also set bars that are way too low. And these too are influenced by police unions. State laws, for example, have established fear of injury as a justification for police officers who use deadly force. Think about qualified immunity. In theory, victims of police violence can file civil rights claims against officers that they think violated their constitutional rights. However, these are only civil claims. Individuals might receive, money or compensatory justice paid out by the city with taxpayer dollars. It gets really expensive. It's not a realistic form of accountability. And these claims hardly ever rise to the standard needed to actually win cases and kind of achieve justice for those families. You can't replace the loss of a life with, compensatory damage. Offending officers, too often they escape criminal prosecution, which we're seeing right now in the police murder of Breonna Taylor in Louisville. And finally, I just want to say another option for accountability is the consent decree, which can ensure accountability. These are agreements forged between police agencies and the federal government, which, we've seen this used in Milwaukee. We can talk about that later on. They authorize the Justice Department to investigate and assess law enforcement issues in a city. But these operate across the entire department, these consent decrees, and they don't necessarily hone in on the behavior of individual police officers, but they're important checks on sort of system-wide abuses of police power. So these are some of the ways that we can conceive of accountability. And I do want to kind of direct this conversation a little more narrowly around the Fire and Police Commission, which has this lengthy history. My basic argument that I want to kind of impress upon you all today is that the Fire and Police Commission has historically emphasized stability over accountability. For the bulk of its history, it's been way too focused on sort of cooling dissent, really chilling political dissent, rather than alleviating the conditions, the structures that actually engender and allow for police abuse of power. Changes to the Fire and Police Commission, have almost always followed episodes of civil violence or police brutality or moments of disruption Even the very creation of the FPC in 1885 is really a response to civil violence, police violence, and the potential threat of disruption. At the same time, it's historically been, grassroots pressure from activists and police accountability advocates from below, mostly coming from Black-led organizations and their political representatives who have challenged the FPC's really defensive posture and kind of forced it to change. And again, just to shine a light on the ACLU of Wisconsin, they've been doing this kind of work for a very, very long time. So I struggle to really think about and call the Fire and Police Commission a civilian review board, because when taking up cases of alleged wrongdoing by the police in Milwaukee, it's almost always turned the investigation process over to the police themselves. The FPC has conducted hearings on public complaints against the police, but it's often has been historically, and has been based on evidence collected by police investigators themselves. And this is a real serious conflict of interest when we think about police accountability, because it undermines democracy, it undermines police accountability as a democratic function. That's changed over the years and since, and I should say I do focus on the first 100 years of the Fire and Police Commission's existence. So from 1885 to about 1984. So there's been a lot that's gone on around the Fire and Police Commission and accountability in the last 30 or so years. And I hope we can have a conversation a little bit later about sort of what's changed in the intervening period since the Fire and Police Commission has gained a bit more authority over the rules making process. But my work focuses more on the first 100 years, which is a really long span of time. So there's a lot to sort of get in. And also the Fire and Police Commission is a board that has historically been appointed by the mayor and always has been. Its members have been appointed for political reasons historically, and often in ways that actually benefit the mayor. So, and the person who comes to mind in my research is Mayor Henry Meyer, who was mayor in the city from 1960 to 1988. And he did use the Fire and Police Commission as sort of a political patronage machine, which it always was. It always was kind of before he even became mayor, it was used, by mayors in power to kind of kick back some political favors to this part-time committee that, had some say in how the police department operated. So the board itself broadly reflects the police department's legitimacy. I really want to stress that point. We shouldn't think about it necessarily as like an agency that's committed to justice. And the board has helped historically to reinforce the idea of policing as a legitimate pursuit and a means of sort of preserving order, law and order, whether it's done so in a sort of liberal fashion or whether it's done so in a more reactionary fashion. And that often changes depending on who is actually in charge of the police department. So this is a central question of my dissertation that I'm writing and finishing up now. How did the Milwaukee Police Department actually establish legitimacy? And how did it use that legitimacy to defend its own interests in the face of, challenges against police misconduct and challenges against this police power that developed over time? And of course, the Fire and Police Commission, has played a really major role in that process. So like, how do we get to a Fire and Police Commission in the city in the first place? It's actually a process that played out in the 1880s. This was a period when this is a rapidly changing city at the time. It's small, it's beginning to boom. Industry is expanding. And you have sort of this developing working class politics in the city as well. And it's also a time of real economic uncertainty and economic precarity for a lot of individuals in the city. Let me tell you, so the FPC, it really does exist because powerful business interests wanted to stabilize the police department during this really combustive period. So for 30 years, the police department had operated since 1855. It was a police force that developed out of a constable system, a night watch system. It had, I think, 8 different changes in police chiefs in its first 30 years. And police chiefs came and went in the department depending on who became the mayor. So when a new mayor was elected into office, you would see, the police chief resign and his entire force come with him. They would all sort of resign in unison because they knew that they would be sort of let go or dismissed by the incoming administration. Policing was entirely, it operated on a spoils system. So, it was kind of a plum job to get, a police position, and it was doled out to the folks who sort of were most committed to the election and the campaign. And so it created this sort of public safety instability that folks wanted to sort of rein in. And the people who really wanted to rein it in were kind of the social and economic elites, the business class. And they were particularly nervous about working class folk gaining power and having control over the police department. This business class had relied on the police department to break strikes and to enforce public order laws and to sort of, basically do their bidding when it came to maintaining the status quo, maintaining public order, and addressing this gaining working class militancy. And this is a period in the 1870s, 1880s, and beyond that's just like, there's a ton of strike activity happening. It's really violent. We're seeing a lot of violent police repression. So they lobby over to the Republicans who are in power in Madison, and it's actually the state legislature that authorizes the Fire and Police Commission's creation and sort of legitimizes the police power in Milwaukee. They do that, and they write this law that sort of lays out the terms of power. It creates a 4-member police commission appointed by the mayor. They have authority it's really the focus is on sort of establishing order within the employees or the ranks of the department. So they're supposed to kind of bring order and stability to the recruitment process, the test taking process, the process of promotions. It's not yet really about oversight, except for when employees are sort of challenging a firing, or when there's a hearing around an employment-based issue. We also see that they have the power to fire the police chief, but only for cause, which is kind of a vague terminology. So that happens, and there's a little bit of order and stability brought to the police department, but working class interests remain powerful, and strikes continue to take place. The city continues to change. It's a wide open town, meaning that vice and corruption are pretty sort of commonplace issues that the community is dealing with and social reformers are concerned about. So we get to the early 20th century in the progressive era, around 1911, and we have another law that's passed to kind of reaffirm the police power. And it's in this law that you see the state Republicans sort of shore up the individual authority of Milwaukee police chiefs. And they basically grant them a chief for life status. They basically have lifetime tenure because the only way to be removed from power is for cause by the Fire and Police Commission. And the Fire and Police Commission is really more of a firewall to protect the interests of the police chief. And this plays out over time in the decades that follow, most notably during the tenure of a police chief named Harold Breyer, which we can talk about later on. And I see that it's already 12:21. So I do want to talk a bit about the relationship between Black Milwaukeeans, which is the subject of my dissertation, their relationship to the police power. And I think folks will find it sort of interesting to know that, challenging police power has been an issue in the community for a very long time. And I want to talk about an example from the 1930s. So the 1930s is sort of the Popular Front era. It's a time when there's a lot of union activism and strikes. Milwaukee's got a socialist mayor. Labor issues are prominent. It's the Great Depression also. So there's a lot of contextual factors happening. But at the same time, we're seeing this growing Black migrant community. Milwaukee had always had a really small Black community that developed a really strong professional class. I'd recommend anyone read this book called Black Milwaukee by Joe Trotter if they want to understand some of that early history. But there was a strike at the Ware Steel Company in 1934, and we saw, for the first time, at least in sort of the sources that I've been looking at, we see the police joining in to basically commit acts of brutality against Black strikebreakers who the Ware Steel Company had hired to sort of break up or to maintain business while these white union members were on strike. So it's one of the first times you see sort of the relationship between industrial capitalism and policing coming into play. Not long after that strike, we have the first documented instance of organized Black resistance to police brutality in Milwaukee, and the Fire and Police Commission will come in here momentarily. So in 1934, police vice squad officers were cracking down on the Sixth Ward's policy gambling racket at the behest of white social reformers, well-to-do social reformers. Black numbers runners, as they were called, people who ran the numbers, were known to pay off beat patrolmen. They had to, in order to avoid being arrested for gambling or for being harassed and intimidated by the police. These practices were kind of muddled when social reformers demanded crackdowns on illicit gambling in Milwaukee's segregated Bronzeville community. So social reformers are on the outside saying we can't have vice in our community, and they're calling on the police to crack down on it. City officials oblige to the demands of the social reformers, and the police spring into action. Class status didn't matter for Black participants who are in the vicinity of this gambling or in the vicinity of the policy wheels. And in August of 1935, two white undercover officers engage in discriminatory stop and frisks. So this history of stop and frisk that the ACLU and others have been exploring, man, this goes back to the 1930s and beyond. So they apprehend a man who's named Robert Johnson, a Black man who was walking at 6th and Galena Street. This white man who, he doesn't have a police uniform on, he's undercover, basically, there's plain clothes, is rummaging through his bag after he stops him. And the white man tells Mr. Johnson, "Shut up, you all should be dead. If I had my way, you wouldn't walk the streets." So this officer strikes him a heavy blow on the jaw, strikes Johnson, almost knocking him to the ground. Another officer comes by and kicks Johnson so hard that he requires medical attention. Vice squad officers reportedly committed other brutal acts around the 6th Ward in Milwaukee's Black District around this time, as they're cracking down on gambling offenses. Middle-class professionals, Black middle-class professionals, see this happening, and they form the community's first explicit police accountability organization, and it's called the 6th Ward Law and Order League, which I think will be a new organization for a lot of folks who are interested in this history. They're kind of responding to the creation of a white citizens law and order league that was more focused on maintaining public order and calling for, assertive policing to control basically petty crime in this Black neighborhood and other morals violations in the community. So this Black-led 6th Ward Law and Order League specifically forms to address police brutality and its impact on public safety in the Bronzeville community. And, the league is sort of organized to confront this idea of value neutral police power. Another tangent is that, my dissertation is about how police power develops and this idea of Milwaukee having an exceptional police force. So that exceptionality is created by the state law that creates the Fire and Police Commission, and it develops over time with, all sorts of different modes of support from the federal government, from, pundits, from different policing experts. So this idea of policing exceptionalism had developed at this point, and in the mid-1930s, that exceptionalism is really critical in terms of structuring the idea of police legitimacy in the community. So the Sixth Ward Law and Order League is here, and they're challenging this idea of an exceptional police force. And this is really important because this is an ongoing struggle today of challenging police legitimacy. So because of the group's precarious social status, being Black men, mostly Black men, I believe, they had to act on the terms that were outlined by the white power structure in the city. And that kind of meant embracing what we think of today as a bad apple logic that castigates sort of individual police officers while maybe letting the larger system off the hook in a lot of ways. So this group, this group matters because they ushered in this long history of Black organizations struggling for accountability in the city. At the League's first community meeting in 1935, this crowd of residents from, quote, all walks of life filled the St. Mark's AME Church on the north side. Quote, this is coming from a newspaper, a socialist newspaper. Almost the entire, quote, colored population of Milwaukee turned out. This Black newspaper in New York, the New York Age, reported, along with, quote, prominent white residents to discuss intolerable acts of police brutality by the MPD's Vice Squad. Among the attendees were white city and county representatives from Milwaukee who were known for supporting issues that were important to Black constituents. And the case of Robert Johnson became the focus of the meeting, right? Robert Johnson, who had experienced this police violence. At the meeting, a resolution was adopted by the Sixth Ward Law and Order League calling for the dismissal of one particular officer because of his brutal actions. As Johnson recounted his attack in front of the meeting goers, he saw one of the officers who brutalized him in the back of the church. This is a clear show of police intimidation. The man's presence, it nearly, quote, provoked a disturbance, but order was immediately restored in the meeting hall. Among the outcomes from this meeting, a committee formed to file petitions of protest and to prepare complaints against instances of police brutality. That's how they framed it. However, it was, quote, definitely made clear that the protests only targeted, quote, certain members of the force. The roughneck element, which has recently succeeded in gaining admission to the department. So again, this emphasis on the bad apples of the department rather than the system as a whole. The MPD, which has long been reputed to be one of the most efficient in the country, that's a quote, participants attested, was not being framed as the cause of the public's outrage. So again, legitimacy affirmed, but Black residents are demanding some responsive anti-racist policing. Just to kind of try to bring this to a wrap, the League attempts to secure justice for Johnson and other brutalized people who experienced violence from the Vice Squad. Members knew about the legal recourse that the FPC offered as a result of that 1911 statute. If I could just pause here for a moment, some sources in the 60s and the 70s, when Black Milwaukeeans and civil rights activists and the federal government are trying to intervene in how police accountability functions in Milwaukee, they often say that there were no public complaints of police brutality for the 60 years between 1911 and 1971. Well, here's an example of a very clear public police brutality complaint. So why that's missing from the sort of formal conversation, that's a question worth asking. Most of my sources come from newspapers writing about this at the time, but there is documentation of this within the Fire and Police Commission's own meeting notes. So members knew about the legal recourse that the Fire and Police Commission offered. Again, the Fire and Police Commission, it can't actually prosecute officers, but it can discipline them. So that's often why people turn to the Fire and Police Commission, either to kind of smooth out an erratic situation with the police or to kind of get these officers disciplined. Johnson himself submits a complaint against his attackers on September 12th, 1935. The grievance charges 2 officers with, quote, assaulting and reviling him. Another member, Jay Gilmer, another member of the Sixth Ward Law and Order League, also files a police complaint, Jay Gilmer. And then what happened next, I think, demonstrates sort of the farce of the MFPC, the FPC as a police accountability system, and about the police department's power. And it shows how the police department has power to really influence this grievance system, really whenever it wanted. for much of the history here. So mysteriously, Robert Johnson's complaint gets dropped. And it was against these vice squad officers, Vaughn Bennett and Louis Wagner. It turns out that the police had arrested a, quote, woman friend of Johnson's, conveniently, on charges that she stabbed another Black woman. And I don't know the circumstances of this case about that stabbing too well, but anytime the timing here comes up so conveniently, my antennas are raised a little bit. At the Milwaukee Safety Building, accompanied by, the famed Black attorney in the city, James Dorsey, Robert Johnson tells the deputy police inspector that he was, quote, willing to do anything to keep this woman out of trouble. So he agrees in a statement, according to the police's deputy inspector, that he was going to drop his police brutality complaint if she would be freed. So, this raises questions about police manipulation of the system to its own benefit. All the police had to do was arrest and charge someone who was close to Robert Johnson, and he had little recourse but to drop this complaint. Whether or not there's you have a stabbing on the one hand and you have police brutality on the other, these should really be separate legal issues. So after that, the League, which is also backed by these two liberal white politicians named Samuel Soroff and the county supervisor, George Herman, they're the local 6th Ward political representatives here. They continue to press the complaint with Milwaukee police and say that they had engaged in this campaign of, quote, intimidation and coercion on the north side. The League files its own complaint against the officers. And in that complaint, they argue that police induced Johnson to relent from his claim and making a, quote, deal to dismiss unrelated charges against an associate he wanted to help. So they actually did see this as, improper, kind of legal behavior here by the police. The commission calls for witnesses to the alleged act, of which there are some. But the Fire and Police Commission stalls the case for a couple weeks. This happens a lot. The Fire and Police Commission is bureaucracy, and I would say that part of I think of them as a cooling chamber that kind of slows down the process of accountability rather than meting out swift justice, the kind of swift justice that Milwaukee's policing system is actually known for nationally, and that developed this sort of exceptionalism idea about policing in the city. So at a hearing in October 1935, Robert Johnson, he fails to appear as a witness. And according to a newspaper, it's that he was afraid he would be, quote, run out of town by police. This speaks to another issue that has a lengthy history in the city, and that's police intimidation and the fears on the public that if they bring their complaints of brutality forward, they're going to be retaliated against the police, who have, as we're seeing in this case, some really awesome powers within City Hall to kind of control the process. Over the head of the current police chief, Chief Laubenheimer, the FPC actually does decide to suspend the police officers, Louis Wagner and Vaughn Bennett, for 60 and 30 days, respectively. So the process kind of works here for the time being, but most likely because of this political pressure that these white politicians apply in backing up the League. So I think that speaks to just the importance of having sort of conventional political power at your back. Although it's so hard when we see some of the cases, police violence, deadly police brutality cases today, how that often is also not the case. The Alderman Soroff, he tells the Fire and Police Commission that after Johnson registered his complaint, that there were also other instances of abuse that were being committed against his Black constituents in the district. But the police, using their discretionary authority, they deflect any of this criticism. They allege that the alderman's playing politics. It remains really sort of business as usual. The police department is able to sort of continue on and sort of conduct their sweeps. And again, as we know through the ACLU's work, stop and frisk has this long history that plays out in Milwaukee. So I'm over time, but what I want to say is just that it's important that we think about the Fire and Police Commission as sort of this stabilizing force for the status quo, for the traditional power. And I think that it's just, if we think about it, it's changed a lot in the last several decades, and we can talk about that, but it needs to I think there needs to be an independent source of police accountability, an independent commission. And listen, committees have sort of offered up these different sort of independent sources of police accountability for a long time in the city. And this police bureaucracy, the mayor, the Fire and Police Commission, the police department itself, have used their authority to sort of scrap any of those kinds of proposals. And we see that continuing on to this day. So look, I'm gonna stop there.
That was just tremendous, Will. Thank you so much for sharing all that information. It was a lot that I didn't realize, and I'm certain a lot of our listeners didn't, and they were certainly responding. There's an ocean of questions waiting for you to answer.
I'm gonna get it. We'll look at some of them now.
Well, let's start by like bringing us a little more into the present day, since you left us in like 1935, which is cool. I learned a lot by listening to this. It's great. But I think there's a question, and just your last comment about how, you know, different structures of accountability have been being created in Milwaukee by the community. I know there are folks on this call right now. I know Sister Rose was deeply involved in that work, you know, 10 or 15 years ago, and continues to be involved in police accountability work today. But, you know, like creating tables of accountability, and then the police and the politicians sort of leave the community out to hang. And I think some of that has been seen a little bit with the Community Collaborative Commission in Milwaukee today, which I know we have some members on the call who are engaged with that important work. But like, then, you know, you see the police sort of creating their own, or the mayor creating a separate system of accountability that they have a little more control over. And so I guess just to sort of speak to some of that, like, you know, do you see the Fire and Police Commission continuing to have an important role today in creating this system of accountability, and what does that look like?
I think inevitably it's gonna continue to have an important role, because, you know, it's what we have as a system to sort of try to provide some measure of accountability. But if it can't really impact sort of criminal prosecution and the legal, the sort of procedural, not even procedural justice, sort of the sort of legal response that we need to some of these abuses of police power, if it can't really legally challenge police union power, I don't know how useful it's really going to be. And I don't know how well I can really speak on sort of the present moment. I'd love to bring in others who might have a better expertise in that.
Well, I mean, one thing that like I would say that they have a very important role is they will be choosing our next police chief in the city of Milwaukee.
Oh, yeah,
so they have like a lot of power right now
to
impact what the culture of policing is going to look like.
Yep.
We have a question in the chat, and I'll just answer this out loud in case other people had the question too. Is the Fire and Police Commission board still appointed by the mayor? The answer to that is yes. They are confirmed by the Common Council, but the mayor forwards the nominees to them and has held public hearings on those commission members for the last few years as they are nominated at the request and insistence of a lot of community groups. The ACLU is one of them, but there are so many others that have been really pushing for that public accountability of who's getting on this board and are they truly representing the community in the way that they need to. Go ahead, Will.
Yeah, no, just to offer a piece of historical context. In the 60s, like this really matters, like who's represented on the board and what they do. Traditionally, you know, it had always been sort of labor representatives or business people or merchants, or there's people who had sort of close ties to the mayor themselves and could offer some sort of political quid pro quo in some way. In the 60s, when the reason we got this sort of autocratic police chief, Harold Breyer, in 1964 is because of this powerful South Side political club that was called the Alliance. It was like the South Side Alliance. And 3 of the South Side Alliance members, all white, of course, were members of the commission. And so was the executive, the paid staff member of the commission, the executive director. And, they made sure that it was Breyer, a native to the South Side, who they respected for both his brazenness on the police department and how he sort of commanded the detectives bureau on the force. And they knew that he would sort of let's just say, be firm in his handling of this developing civil rights movement in the city at that time. So it really matters who's reflected on the commission, and it matters that we kind of remain incisive about the relationships to the mayor and the existing political system, because we want the community to have the lead voice in sort of determining who's going to be on this body that's going to determine police policy, procedure, and who the police chief is going to be.
Molly, you brought up something, and I know there are a lot of historical questions in there, but you brought up how it was the influence of the public that got the mayor to begin having these vetting sessions to see who gets approved or heard and which communities are respected and represented in the FPC. There are at least 2 FPC open seats right now, and a couple of folks have asked whether or not, how do we put pressure on the mayor to submit nominations? And I will say before I turn it over to Will, there is an online version of this for folks to submit nominations, and Molly and I did open records requests and found out that of the, I think at that time, 37 people that had applied to be on the Fire and Police Commission through the online process, only 1 ever got a call back from the mayor's people. And so regardless of what the procedural answer is, contacting your older person or another person who holds sway with the mayor seems to be the only way I have seen in 14 years to get somebody on the FPC, unless, of course, you bring in a couple of hundred people to a public vetting session.
Sometimes that pressure is the way to go.
So I think there's so many good questions. We're never going to get to them all in time. But one of them is, Maura asked if there's any tension historically between the executive director of the commission and the commission in terms of making decision-making authority regarding complaints about police actions. And people might, just to give folks on the call a little background, there is a paid staff of the commission, and then there's the commission itself, or the board members. So those are 2 sort of separate bodies. But or really one works for the other. So I guess, like, Will, that was a history question. So I'm going to turn it to you if you have an answer.
Yeah, no, I know that has been more recently in the last few decades, some tension between the executive director and the sort of representatives on the commission. I know there's some folks listening to this conversation who have some expertise on this as well, because they've shared it with me, and it's been really enlightening and interesting to read. But by law, it's important to know that it's the fire and police commissioners themselves who really have the authority legally to sort of make decisions about the commission. And while there may have been sort of moments of tension in more recent history, and when I say recent history, I'm always talking about like the last 3 decades. But in the 100 years that preceded that, I can't think of scenarios where the actual executive director had tension with the rest of the commission. They really operated in almost lockstep. And the commissioners themselves, they were somewhat powerful people in the community. They were powerful people in the community, but they were also sort of part-time. The executive director handled the day-to-day. And accountability in terms of police complaints wasn't the focus. We have to think about the Fire and Police Commission is really focused on being sort of an employee civil service board. It's the first one in the country. It's the first public safety civil service board in the country. And they were really focused in their part-time capacity on handling these employment issues. Their responsibilities grow in the late 60s and into the 70s with the war on crime. And they become sort of the clearinghouse for any Milwaukee area grant applications through the Law Enforcement Assistance Association after Congress passes the Safe Streets Act. So that's an added responsibility that comes onto the commission's docket. And at the same time, you do have civil rights groups and others, the ACLU, challenging for the commission to do more around the complaint review function. But the vast majority, upwards of 90 to 95% of police complaints are actually going to the police department. And the police department is still being called on to review the few police complaints that actually come into the commission. And some complaints are going to the Milwaukee Community Relations Commission, which is this other sort of civil rights agency set up by the city. So I don't know, I lost track of what I was saying, but executive directors, probably there's been more attention recently since they've assumed more power. The commission got more power in the mid 1980s after the state revised that law that established the commission in the first place, and they gave them more policymaking authority, but stuff transpired after that too.
So this is another question about sort of those powers that you just talked about. And it's a really long question, and I think this could be a whole separate session that we could have, but are there examples of ways in which a police commission does effectively oversee a police department? In communities such as Shorewood, where a police commission is not an oversight body, but is only involved in hiring, promoting, and disciplining officers, how can a police commission screen candidates to ensure officers are appropriate for the job? Does anybody want to dig into that?
Well, I want to turn it to you, Molly, because I know you shared a really great document with us that looked at police accountability broadly and how civilian review boards have kind of been structured over time and which ones have been effective and which ones haven't, right? And there's just a lot of criteria that goes into what might make one an effective board. The only one that comes to mind from that piece you shared was Newark, was it? You might have had one of the better civilian review boards.
Yeah, I mean, I think like that has been a model, and we're seeing other models right now developing around the country. I think like we should get into that more on a different session, but I think like there is a lot of power in hiring and promotion and discipline too, right? So like I think that those are important functions, and making sure we have people with the sort of right mindset who are going to be, you know, more of that guardian model than an occupying force, you know, and then how do we move away from some of these ideas about what the police's responsibility is, and how do we divest from some of that, the funding that we're dumping into police budgets and move it into other community functions that actually solve the problems of the community, and you know, allow folks to access what they need. So drug and alcohol treatment services, mental health services, like a lot of those things don't necessarily need to be and should not be police functions. So I think that that's another piece of that as well, as sort of like a broader community conversation that we're all part of right now.
Molly, connected to that question and in how effective the Milwaukee Fire and Police Commission might be based on the power of statutes. For years, I've heard, oh, the Fire and Police Commission is, at least on paper, the most powerful one in the country. And are there examples historically of how the Fire and Police Commission hasn't been just seen as an insurance agency to support the status quo of policing as usual in Milwaukee? Are there examples of when the community has had representatives on this commission who have acted in the best interest of the people, not in the best interest of the mayor and the police chief? Because if it is the most powerful in statute, then hopefully there's some way we can use this multi-tool for reform here in Milwaukee.
Yeah, I think like one of the things like is a problem with the commission is that the mayor is not necessarily, it's not in his best interest to promote people to the commission who are going to be people who shake things up, right? And so like occasionally there's been somebody who got on there who is a shaker up person, and that has been really helpful. And I think the other piece of this that was really important, at least in the last 10 years, as I've been watching the Fire and Police Commission in Milwaukee more closely, is like when 10 years ago, nobody ever went to the Fire and Police Commission meetings. They operated, I think, like largely in secret. Like the ACLU executive director, Chris Amity, went to those meetings, but usually like it was like him and them in the room together. And I think like with the sort of coalition for justice and the movement that arises around Dontre Hamilton's murder, people really started paying attention and showing up. And then that also sort of required more of the commissioners. They realized, like, oh, if I don't ask some questions, if I just like sit here and listen to this report and then we adjourn and call it a day, like people are going to be really upset about that. And I think that that has sort of necessarily made them step into their roles a little more clearly, or at least some of them. You see it happen in real time with some.
Yeah,
The ones that aren't physically sleeping during the meetings.
Yeah, I would just add to that. It's always public pressure. It's always grassroots pressure from below that actually forces this oversight board to do its job when it comes to public complaints of police abuse of power. The first time that they actually fired an officer who killed a Black citizen after many tragic examples preceding it was Ernest Lacey in 1983. That was the first time, by my research, that the Fire and Police Commission acted to fire the officer who was primarily responsible for asphyxiating Lacey in a fashion very similar to George Floyd. And that's after the largest, until today in 2020, with the marvelous movement we're seeing, that was the largest sort of grassroots movement for police accountability in the city's history, lasting a couple of years, with hundreds of participants, more than 75 organizations involved. But it took that massive pressure just to get this one officer fired, and they had no intention of actually firing this officer without that pressure.
So many good questions.
Yeah.
One is coming from Linda, who said, Will said the FPC can't really challenge police union power. Why not?
It's a good question. I think I would answer it just by saying at the same time, and this is something I'm kind of working through in my own research with how both the Milwaukee Police Association, but also more broadly, how police union power sort of ascended. And it ascended in parallel fashion to the civil rights movement, with police officers beginning to think of themselves as sort of a protected class of civil service workers who had their own unique set of rights that demanded sort of legal recognition. For 10 years, from about 1970 to 1980, you've got the city's Police Patrolmen's Protective Association, which is renamed the Milwaukee Police Association in the mid-70s somewhere. They're fighting for this police officer Bill of Rights law to sort of establish legal rights for police officers that are different from everyday sort of civilian rights. And at the same time, they're also negotiating for more power at the bargaining table with the city. There's a strike in 1971. What I want to say is that they get themselves in the room and they get themselves at the negotiating table over contracts, and they stipulate certain things in contracts. I don't have the specifics for you right now, but there are protections for police officers within union contracts. I mentioned the Ernest Lacey case, when the mayor created this special advisory council to sort of monitor what was happening with the Fire and Police Commission and the Coalition for Justice for Ernest Lacey. The police union had representatives at the table there to kind of make sure that the police rank and file had a voice. So, my answer is just like, the unions have a seat at the table, and they also have legal protections both at the national, state, and local level that help to shore up their power.
And Paul
we've
Mosina
seen their
added,
lobbyists.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to say, Paul Mosina added in the chat also that the FPC delegates its authority to negotiate with the police association and other police unions to the city's labor negotiator as well.
They like to
So the FPC doesn't do that direct negotiation anymore.
I believe it, Paul.
Yeah, Paul's a great source. I trust Paul's research here.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sorry, Emilio, did you have something that you were?
The only thing I was adding is that we see that they still have their lobbyists. So when we've been in Madison on any number of a variety of topics, there is the Milwaukee Police Department's lobbyist pushing with state legislators from all over, not just Milwaukee, in an effort to protect and promote these extra citizen rights that they are giving police officers, which is a problem. And even historically, moving up a couple of decades, the difficulties and the protections that former Milwaukee police officer Mike Vagnini and the other uniformed officers who were accused of anally raping 74 civilians while in uniform, that had to be flushed out by the DOJ and federal folks because there was a wall.
Yeah, and as I mentioned earlier, it really matters who's in power in the Justice Department, right? How much can you get done right now in the last 4 years?
So there's so many questions we haven't gotten to.
Jody has a future dissertation lined up for you, a body of questions on the side.
We have a lot of ideas for a future session. I think maybe we might have to come back to some of these. But one question that I think is really important is Cassandra talks about the Chicago Alliance Against Racist and Political Repression, and they are moving an ordinance in Chicago that is going to be a more community control board and less of what we're seeing with the Fire and Police Commission. And she asks, is there a realistic way to shift the FPC to look more like it's community controlled over police? And I guess like, I'm gonna say, I'm gonna be Debbie Downer and say like, probably not. Like a lot of what the FPC is in state law. And so it would require state legislation to change, for example, who puts the people on the board. And I don't think that our current legislature would be interested in doing anything that would increase community control over police.
Now, at the same time, it's really fascinating to look at the history of folks on the North Side, police accountability activists, Black Power organizations, the Wisconsin ACLU. All folks came together in the early 70s and envisioned what community control of the police would actually look like. Just whether or not it's realistic, it's really fascinating to dig into the sources and see how they saw public safety being controlled, self-determined by the community itself. It's a place to turn for some ideas, but as Molly's saying, the way that sort of state federalism works with the state and its relationship to Milwaukee's sort of weak municipal power, they have a lot of control over how, you know, something like the police department and its police bureaucracy operates. But we have been really visionary in our sort of imaginings of community control over the years, and it's fed a lot of police accountability activism. And sometimes some groups like the United Black Community Council just rejected the Fire and Police Commission and held their own trials in the community when police officers brutalized Black citizens, and they charged the police officers even though they had no authority to, you know, to arrest them.
I feel like we should end on a high note. Well, Amelia, you got something for us?
Yes. So we only have a couple of minutes, and there's an incredible amount of food for thought. And what we'd like this to be is a baseline for us to begin having these thoughts about how do we envision greater civilian accountability of the police, and how do we envision some of what Molly was putting a frame for before. How do we re-envision what our society looks like without this over-reliance on the police? What are the alternatives we can get at? And that's why National Lawyers Guild, ACLU, and these other folks, as part of a citywide collaboration, we're very fortunate to have Will Tchakirides come and share his knowledge about where the Fire and Police Commission has been historically, so that we can use that as a base kit of Lego and figure out where we want to go as Milwaukee in the future. So all of you that have registered, a big thank you, and we will be reaching out to you via email to invite you to further discussions where we will actually begin trying to write what the solution is. And I'd like to have a big thank you from all of us to Will for sharing your extensive research. I've learned a lot. Thank you.
My pleasure. No doubt.
If you have future questions, please just shoot the email that you've seen on the side, or register in the same way you registered before, and we'll share those. Thank you. Have a great day.
Bye, guys.